No sé, ahí sí, ahí empezamos. Bueno, well, good morning or good afternoon. First of all, I apologize for my bad English. I welcome you to the second talk of the conference series for the presentation of the book Global Resurgence of the Right. The idea of making this book, edited by Gastón, Souroujon, and myself, emerged a couple of years ago as an initiative of the Center of Comparative Study of the Faculty of Political Science and International Relations of the National University of Rosario. Our intention was for this work to reflect on the most appropriate conceptual categories to account for the phenomenon of the rights and also its expression in a variety of national case studies focusing on Austria, Italy, Spain, Argentina, Brazil, Ecuador, and the United States. In this sense, through 13 chapters, we bring together specialists from around the world, among which is Hans-Georg Betz that is with us today. Last, I invite you next Monday to the third talk, Why Right Populism Failed in the United States, which we will dictated by George Hawley from the University of Alabama at 6 p.m. From Argentina. I don't want to steal more of your time. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you very much, Hans. Gastón.
Okay, welcome to everybody. On this occasion, we are pleased to have the presence of Hans-Georg Betz. He's a professor of political science in the University of Zurich, and a senior fellow at the Center for Analysis of the Radical Right. He's the author of many books like Radical Right-Wing Populism in Western Europe and Postmodern Politics in Germany. We want to publicly say thanks to Hans-Georg Betz for having collaborated in this book that we are presenting now, especially for make an excellent chapter. I think his chapter in this book called 40 Years of Radical Right-Wing Populism and Assessment will be very soon a reference of this subject. Also, we want to thank Hans-Georg Betz for being part of this meeting and share with us some conclusion of this conference, which title is Beyond Resentment: The Role of Emotion in Populist Mobilization. So, after the conference, of course, we will have some minutes to make question, comment, etc. And Hans-Georg Betz, you have the word. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Gastón. A couple of things before I go into what I want to talk about today. I mean, the first kind of thing is it's what always kind of irritates me is when I read another article which is basically explaining the emergence and rise of the radical right, so radical right and populism. These parties have been around now for 40 years. And some of these parties, like the Front National, which is now called Rassemblement National in France, are among the most established political parties in Western Europe. I mean, the same thing is certainly true for the FPÖ in Austria. The same is true in the country where I live, in Switzerland, the Schweizer Volkspartei, the Swiss People's Party. The Lega Nord, as a matter of fact, or what is now called La Lega, is the oldest political party still existing after the collapse of the post-war party system in Italy. So to say basically, we are talking about the emergence of these kind of political party, it's a joke as far as I'm concerned. Secondly, I mean, these parties are here to stay, and they are still around, and they will be around. I mean, there was a couple of months ago, there was a question, I mean, COVID-19, what is it going to do to these kind of political parties? Is that going to be the end of populism? No. Okay, I looked actually at France has an election next year, presidential election, and an election for the Assemblée Nationale. Marine Le Pen is credited around 30% of the vote. If she gets into the second round of the election, which everybody expects, she's going to get around 40% of the vote. We're going to have elections in a couple of weeks in Germany. The AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, hovers around 10-11%, which hasn't really moved up or down over the last couple of months. In Sweden, there are going to be elections next year, national elections. Sweden Democrats hovering around 20%, also very stable. In Switzerland, where I live now, the SVP is the strongest party with about 25% of the vote, and that has also not particularly changed over the last kind of thing. So these parties are here; they are here to stay, and in very many cases, they're actually very much established in the party system. So I mean, the question for me is not so much to explain the emergence of these political parties, but it's more actually what explains that they managed to maintain themselves and maintain themselves very well. Because I mean, what Marine Le Pen, if you listen to Marine Le Pen these days, I mean, she says exactly the same thing she said about 20 years ago. The same is, I mean. In some cases, the rhetoric changes. The Lega now no longer talks about separation of northern Italy, but the question of sovereignty, the question of anti-EU and whatnot has been around for ages in the Lega, and yet people still vote for the Lega. Now, one explanation I want to give for that, and this is one I want a little bit talk about, is that what these parties are good at is to actually appeal to emotions. And what we are seeing today, I think, and what we've seen over the last couple of decades, but particularly today, and in that regard, I mean, there is some change, is actually that emotions have been, politics has become very emotional. And there is actually a politics of emotion, if you want, okay? And populists are particularly apt, they're particularly good in appealing to emotions. And these are not just negative emotions. I mean, usually, the argument is, they raise particularly resentment, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, anger, rage, anxiety, and whatnot. But they also evoke hope. I mean, if you looked at any of the meetings which Trump did in the United States, there was a lot of hope among these people. I mean, finally, things are going to change in this country. Okay. And Trump was actually very good at evoking a whole range of emotions in his speeches and in his campaigns. But in most cases, in the emotions which populists evoke, and at least radical right-wing populists evoke, and particularly here in Europe, but also elsewhere in other parts of the world, and I'm also going to talk a little bit about that, is actually negative emotions. And I want to start out actually with an election spot, which the Sweden Democrats, which, as I said, now is credited with about 20% of the vote, did in 2010. You can actually find it on YouTube if you go into, the name of the Sweden Democrats is Sverige Demokraterna, and the thing is Valfilm 2010, VALFILM 2010. It's a 10-second spot. It's a very dark, dystopian spot, which reminded me actually of a famous film by Terry Gilliam, Brazil. It starts out basically, the first kind of thing is just numbers. A whole range of numbers, basically 12, a row of 12 numbers, which is basically the budget, the Swedish budget. And then you see a table with two people, a woman and a man, counting money. And then comes the next kind of thing. You see an elderly white woman with a stroller trying to basically advance towards this table. And then you have another shot, and you see about 5 or 6 dark in chador, in this traditional black garb, obviously Muslim women pushing strollers. And it's a race basically between this elderly woman and these 6 migrants trying to get to the table. And then you can see, I mean, you have to push basically, let's say you have to push something which says either pension or migration. Okay. And what the whole kind of thing is, I mean, this is a race and the white woman is losing. Okay. Now, when you watch this kind of thing, I mean, obviously, when you watch something, I mean, you interpret what you see. Now, I interpret the whole thing that if I were a Swedish and I would watch this, I would, on the one hand, get angry. Why would this elderly woman be subjected to having to basically, engage in this race to get, something which she deserves, which is basically a pension? Secondly, there would be obvious anxiety. Is she going to make it, or is she not going to make it? There might be resentment towards these bureaucrats who look basically totally dispassionate, who look as if they don't care at all what is happening to this elderly kind of woman. Okay, and you get this you get this very emotional kind of impact of this election spot. Okay. Second example, also from the Scandinavian country. This is the election program of the Dansk Folkeparti, the Danish People's Party, from 2001. Okay, it says here, Denmark's future, this country, this election. Okay, and it really is this country's election. And election is not just it doesn't mean only election, but it also means choice. Okay, so 2001, you have your country and you have a choice, and this is the choice here, and you can see it in the pictures here. This is the choice you get. You want this, or you want this. Okay. And actually, if you look inside the book, there are tons of these pictures. And actually, funnily enough, lots of them are actually from Berlin-Kreuzberg. Because Berlin-Kreuzberg is basically, that's the district in Berlin, which has a larger Turkish origin population. And this is basically the Danish kind of nightmare. Denmark becomes like Berlin-Kreuzberg. Okay, so if you don't want that, you better vote for the Danish People's Party. And what this appeals to, I mean, in lot is nostalgia. A nostalgia for a time when Denmark was still Denmark, when there weren't all these foreigners there, all these migrants there. A third example of how this works comes from the Flemish part of Belgium. Okay. This is a book by the women's representatives of the Vlaams Belang, which is the radical popular right in Flanders, which in the last election actually went up to 19% of the vote nationally. And it basically, I mean, this is just part of a larger kind of campaign which they did, including one where you had the daughter of the leader of the party, De Winter, actually in a bikini, but dressed in a chador, but underneath a bikini, to basically, and again, I mean, it's this, the contrast. Do you want this, which is us, or do you want that, which is them? Okay. Again, a very kind of emotional kind of appeal to people. No, we don't want that. Okay, so what these what the populist radical right basically appeals to is emotions, anxiety, fear, indignation, resentment, what is called embitterment, anger, rage. In German, we have actually this, a couple of years ago, we had this Wutbürger, the citizens full of rage, expressed basically in these demonstrations in Dresden of Pegida, this anti-Islamic movement in Germany. Okay. Now, why these emotions? And why particularly resentment and particularly nostalgia these days? Now, I wanna propose a simple model for this and show how one can explain and how this might basically work. And I start out with actually an observation, which, because you mentioned Fukuyama, which Fukuyama talks about, but many others talk about, and this is my starting point is Nancy Fraser. Is the question of recognition, the importance of recognition, and the importance of respect and dignity. Okay, it is quite amazing. I mean, if you read some of these books in nowadays on or newspaper articles on social scientists or journalists going out, for example, to the eastern part of Germany or going out to Wisconsin, or the Midwest in general in the United States. And when they talk to people, I mean, people basically, I mean, they tell them, well, they don't really give us any respect. We don't count for them. Okay, we are nothing. Okay. But self-esteem, respect, and dignity are very, very important. Okay. And there's a whole, if you look in social psychology, there's a whole literature nowadays basically on this, which makes this kind of link to whatnot. But also a social philosopher like Charles Taylor have been writing about the importance basically of recognition of respect. Okay. If you look at the literature on populism, I mean, one which I really like very, very much is an article by Robert Jansen on populist mobilization, which is fundamentally on Latin America. And he in his definition of populism, he says, populism promotes a rhetoric that valorizes ordinary people, that gives valor to ordinary people. Same Ben Stanley, in his essay on populism as a thin ideology, makes the observation that the conceptual core of populism rests on the valorization of the people and then the denigration of the elite. Giving value to people, restoring value to the people. And I know actually a little bit of Latin American populism. I mean, if you look, for example, at Gaitán, or if you look at Perón, the camisados became, he turned it completely around. The notion of chusma in Gaitán's kind of case, he turned it completely around. And actually, it was a badge of honor for those who basically, and says, you are the ones actually who are the important people in this country, not the elite, not these people who look down upon it. Okay. Now, why? What's the importance basically of recognition? I mean, the argument basically is, and here I refer to a wonderful article which Mabel Berezin wrote a couple of years ago on Trump, trying to explain Trump. And she basically says what has happened over the last couple of decades is a growing devalorization of people. Okay, people have lost their value. Okay, now she gives two reasons for that. I mean, there are other reasons, but main reasons for that. One is basically technological innovation and change. In the old days, if you are a blue-collar worker, and particularly, I mean, I remember when when East Germany was still around, I mean, that was the worker elite, it was called. In the Soviet Union, I mean, workers were supposedly, basically, I mean, the elite in society. In German, we had a saying, when the Arbeiter es will, stehen alle Räder still. When the worker wants it, all the wheels stop, basically. This was a time when there were unions. This was a time basically when there were all kinds of associations, workers' associations. And this was a time when there were political parties like the Social Democrats, the Socialists, and the Communists who represented the interests of these kind of people. This has all changed. Unions have basically virtually disappeared in some countries. In other countries, they have been decimated. Left-wing parties or left-wing in name only. I mean, particularly if you look at what happened in Germany or in Britain with Tony Blair and Gerhard Schröder, neoliberalism was adopted in many cases by a lot of these kind of political parties. So a lot of people basically lost their value, not only in terms of their workforce, but also in terms of the political value as voters. Okay. So that's one part. The other one is basically at the same time what has happened, particularly in the United States. I mean, Mabel Berezin, of course, she's American. She talks about this. Is that in the public media, in films and on television, increasingly, I mean, ordinary people became kind of the butt of jokes. It became kind of common to make fun of them. You could look down upon them. I mean, she gives as the example Archie Bunker in the United States in All in the Family. Okay, but you find it in I mean, I know. I mean, one of the things which I know is in Germany there was something similar to Archie Bunker, which was a very popular kind of show too. And at the same time, I mean, certain names were introduced to talk about these people, like in Britain, the notion of chavs. Okay, I had absolutely no idea what that meant, quite frankly. I mean, you know, and I had to learn, actually, I had to talk to people. I mean, what do you mean by these kind of things? In America, I knew, I mean, there was always rednecks and hillbillies and rubes. I mean, all of these kind of notions were around. In German, we also have Hinterwäldler, which I come from Bavaria. The Bavarians were always called Hinterwäldler, those who live behind the woods and have absolutely no clue about the rest of the world. So increasingly, I mean, there was a certain kind of notion that people were looked down, ordinary people were looked down upon, that they were regarded with contempt. And then, particularly because the argument then was, I mean, they're hopeless anyway. I mean, they're all, you know, I mean, kind of like what Obama said, but then also Hillary Clinton. I mean, they're basically racists, misogynists, gun-loving, nationalists, whatever. Okay. Now, it's very interesting, actually. I ran across a couple of months ago, I mean, Bernie Sanders did an interview, which then was basically reproduced in the New York Times. And one of the things Bernie Sanders actually, he said, with respect to basically what had happened in 2016, when there were Trump won a lot basically in what the Americans basically refer to as flyover country, which is very often rural kind of areas. He said the following: there is, in the United States, there is no appreciation of rural America and of their values. There is no recognition, basically, of the sense of community which exists in rural America. Somehow or the other, the intellectual elite does have, in some cases, contempt for the people in rural America. Okay. And I think, I mean, this is absolutely right. I mean, you can see it not only in the United States, also in Europe, basically. I mean, the disdain. And I always, when I teach my course on populism, I always start out with the famous, with a famous quote, Latin quote, "Odi vulga." What is it? I hate the ordinary masses, and I stay away as far as possible. Horatius, "Odi profanum vulgus et artio." Okay, this kind of notion that the vulgus, the vulgar kind of masses, you better stay away from these kind of people. Okay. Now, I mean, obviously, then, if that is the case, there are all kinds of emotions which get provoked by in this kind of scenario. I mean, on the one hand, there is the anxiety, growing anxiety among vast or large number of people, particularly in what is called the middle classes, which fear that they are losing their status. Now in the United States, but also in Europe increasingly, I mean, this is not only associated with just people, it's associated with gender. The famous or infamous kind of angry white men, but also with white people. I mean, the whole debate now in the United States about white supremacy, which we are increasingly also seeing over in Western Europe, because, I mean, we certainly have very similar kind of tendencies, are reflected in this kind of anxiety that we become kind of strangers in our own lands, which is a very, a very common kind of trope. And if you look, I mean, the other day, actually, I saw a survey, and unfortunately, I don't remember where it was, from France, where they asked people, I mean, what do you think? You think France in 2100 is going to be a Muslim country? And some 50% of respondents said yes. Okay, I mean, there is this kind of, and obviously, I mean, I don't know to what degree, but the notion basically of the great replacement, which at one point was basically on the far right, on the extreme right, namely that the indigenous, if you want, population, white, French, or whatnot, are going to be gradually replaced by non-whites, has now become fairly mainstream in the media and whatnot in some countries. Okay. On the other hand, you get obviously resentment. I mean, resentment is based on a notion basically of unfairness. We are not treated fairly. And if I go back to this election spot, basically the elderly white woman is not treated fairly. She is Swedish, and as a Swedish citizen, she should get preference. But no, what happens? All these immigrants get preference. They get all the stuff. Now, this is actually, if you read actually what happens in Germany after the election, when the AfD for the first time gets into the Bundestag, and West German journalists go to East Germany, and they talk to people and they say, hey, I mean, all these refugees come here, and these refugees, they get everything. And in some cases, they come here and they have a Rolex watch, and they have a iPhone, blah, 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 all these kind of things. And on top of it, they get everything. If I just want to get some kind of subsidy for buying who knows what, I have to write to 50 different offices and fill out, 50 different kind of forms. And at the end, they tell me, we don't have any money for that. Okay. And this is fundamentally unfair. We are being treated unfair. And response to this kind of thing is this kind of call for, I mean, there should be what the Front National used to call préférence nationale. There should be national preference. There should be, or now what Marine Le Pen says, there should be priorité nationale, a national priority. Our people should come first. Now, that this is not just on the radical right shows what has happened in Denmark. I mean, in the last election, the left won the election, and now we have a socialist or a social democrat who is the prime minister of Denmark. And one of the first kind of things did was they really made it very difficult to enter the country. They put all kinds of things on immigration in Denmark, and among the things was that any immigrant who came to any refugee who came to Denmark had to basically empty their pockets and hand over the money in order to prevent basically this kind of notion that they're getting everything. I mean, they were supposed to kind of pay for their own kind of upkeep. Okay. A third kind of thing is nostalgia. I mean, nostalgia also feeds into this, namely this kind of notion that we want to go back to a time where ultimately we counted. And it's not for nothing that you now get basically, I mean, Marine Le Pen talks a lot about the Trente Glorieuses, the post-war period of the economic boom times. The Sweden Democrats basically have adopted the main kind of program of the post-war socialists, the so-called Volkshemmet, the People's Home, which was a large kind of program of social welfare and all of these kind of things for them. And in many cases, these political parties have now actually promote themselves as the protector, basically, of the national welfare state, but only for basically our people. Our people should come first. Okay. Now, this kind of model feeds, as far as I'm concerned, feeds into a lot of the kind of debates which we are having nowadays when it comes to populism. I mean, obviously, it feeds into, this kind of debate. Is it economics or is it cultural, or is it cultural and economics? Emotions, obviously, and what triggers these kind of emotions, questions of recognition, questions of dignity and whatnot, are much more on the cultural side than they are on the economic side. Although they're also on the economic side. It also fits into another kind of thing which increasingly we are seeing, which is this new kind of cleavage between the cosmopolitanism and parochialism. And here, by the way, I mean, parochialism is one can see how these kind of things work, because parochialism nowadays has a negative connotation. Parochialism actually comes from Old French, which it refers to basically a parish. In Italy, it's called campanilismo, which is it's basically the local kind of community. And it's really, I mean, this kind of cleavage is really, I mean, on the one hand, those who fundamentally have their home at home, but also in the rest of the world, and those who fundamentally are kind of rooted, if you want, in their local kind of community. But it is also associated with this kind of notion of what the French call la société ouverte et fermée, the open and the closed society, basically, which is a new kind of trope. It obviously fits into the growing literature, basically, on status anxiety, and last not least, into this kind of notion of white supremacy. Okay. Now, because the reasons for these kinds of emotions change, obviously, I mean, the radical populist right has an open field. I've not the focus here what is going to come, in a couple of years, but I'm sure, I mean, right now it's COVID-19, which raises all kinds of emotions. And again, I mean, the radical populist right in very many kind of ways tap into these kind of things in very emotional kind of ways. I mean, in Germany now, the AfD, I mean, they talk about, the new totalitarianism, we are the Sicherheitsstaat, which actually, I mean, security state, which actually came from the left. I remember it in the 1970s during the anti-nuclear movement. Emotions, the emotions are provoked in different kind of ways, but the radical populist right very often, I mean, finds very clever ways to kind of respond to these kind of things. So that's my little kind of thing on that.
Okay, thank you very much. It's very interesting, everything. Here are some questions. I have a question. Gisela, you have a question? No?
Yes, I put it in the chat.
Okay.
If you want to read it.
Before only because you have a question doesn't mean I can answer it.
Okay.
I'm not omniscient, I mean,
It's a common question. You say that resentment is related to something unfair, to something that is not right, no? To no recognition. Okay. this sentiment, I think, is not naturally linked with any color political. You know, the resentment, you can find resentment, as you say, in Peronismo, in the Atlantic Revolution, in many. So the question is, how the mainstream party or the central left party can dispute the meaning of this emotion, can dispute the articulation of this emotion, because like Chantal Mouffe said, this passion the passion cannot be eradicated from political space. So when the mainstream party don't work on it, the populist or the right-wing populist party take advantage of this. I don't know if I make it clear.
Yeah. But one of the observations which is universally made when it comes to resentment and nowadays, I mean, the notion is that resentment is something positive for society, basically because it's like the canary in the coal mine, which raises alarm, and it's associated with a notion of injustice. Okay. Somebody was treated unfairly, somebody was treated in an unjust kind of way, all right? Now, the next kind of point is, I mean, and what populism then does is, it's not just an injustice, but there is somebody there who basically committed the injustice. I mean, the injustice, there is a perpetrator, basically. Now, the perpetrator is obviously, I mean, the political establishment. The political establishment, which fundamentally did not, is either not listening to people, ignores people, who they pursue their own kind of interests, even if these interests hurt basically the kind of individual. Now, my kind of thing, I mean, I'm very skeptical actually. You know, that it's easy, basically, I mean, to counter these kind of things, because in very many ways, I mean, there is a lot, I mean, there is now a recognition among a lot of people who write about populism that, you know, I mean, a lot of the things are justified. Modern societies generate all kinds of injustices, and it's often very difficult to basically remedy these injustices. Okay, particularly, and that's the other kind of thing, particularly given the fact, I mean, in the old days, if there was an injustice, people were poor, not because they didn't want to work, but for whatever kind of reason. You basically threw money at the thing. This is what welfare states were very good at to do. The problem comes when you get, as a result of, you know, what is nowadays referred to as financialization and neoliberal, but all these kind of things. When basically, I mean, the policy space of governments is very limited when it comes to these things, and you get to actually, you have to make very hard choices. And, you know, I mean, these choices basically are not particularly obvious to many people. I mean, I give you a concrete example. When about 3 decades ago in Bavaria, we had a political party called the Republikaner, which was basically, I mean, like the Front National. Okay, there was a place in Munich which was very much working class. It's called Hausenbergl, and they're the Republikaner. I mean, in Munich they got like 5% of the vote, but there they got, let's say, 20% of the vote. Okay. Now, I happen to have a friend who was very high up in the Social Democrats, and he told me he went actually to people he knew and said, you know, who did you vote for? And they said Republikaner. I said, why did you vote for Republikaner? And this woman says, well, listen, I mean, our son just got married, okay? In Munich, it was at the time, was very difficult to find an apartment. Okay, so he was looking for an apartment because he had very much money. He wanted to have a social apartment because what is called in German the social Sozialwohnung, a social apartment, subsidized apartment. And he went there, he wrote, his application. He didn't get it. Why? Because only, the way she said it, Turks get it. Okay. So he said, well, so he went to the city administration and said, this woman said, only Turks get it. Well, why is that? They said, well, that is, it's a little bit, crude, but it's true. Because at one point we basically, made a decision, and the decision was who can apply for these kind of things. We have to have some objective criteria, and the number of children then became the objective criterion. Okay, if you had more children, you were more in need of these things. Germans don't have children. The Turkish immigrants have children, basically. Funnily enough, I heard the same thing in Northern Italy, in Milan. In Milan was exactly, who got the social housing? Southerners. So what the Lega called the Terroni, who came from Sicily, who came from Calabria, who knows what, Campania to the north. And again, social housing went to them because they had 3 children. Northern Italians had 1 child. Okay. Now, for a good Bavarian mother, this is unjust, okay? But there is nothing ultimately. If you're on the left, what you gonna do? Now you're gonna say, well, now we have to give, we have to come up with new criteria in order to it's a hard choices. And increasingly, we see, in a world where ultimately, resources are scarce, when they come from the public, you have to make hard choices, and they create injustices. And in many cases, there are no obvious solutions which really satisfy people. Now, the Republican also didn't, well, actually, they had a solution. They would say, Germans first. That's the solution. But if you're on the left, you can say Germans first. It's as simple as that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, here in Argentina we have some problem very similar. Gisela, ¿querés leer algunas de las preguntas?
Yes. I have a question that linked to another question, that the first question in the chat. You should say they appeal to the injustice feeling, and the guilt is of the political establishment, right? But what happened when they are the political establishment? Once they get to the power, what happened? And I link this question to the first question: while they are in government or in the opposition, the emotional appeals change.
Well, one has to distinguish in Europe between Central and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. First of all, I'm not particularly, because also don't read the languages. I'm not particularly good on Poland and Hungary, where they actually are not just in government, but they are regimes. Okay, particularly in Hungary, but in Western Europe, we've had governments which included. We had governments which included populist parties, except for one government where you actually had 2 populist parties in Italy, the Lega and Cinque Stelle, but that was very short-lived. Now, generally, when 2 things, when they're confronted with reality, things change very much. Give you an example. The Lega Nord had, the first thing they want, the Lega Nord, basically what it wanted was autonomy for the northern part of Italy, particularly when it came to taxes and money. They fundamentally said, we're not going to give 1 cent any longer to the Southerners and to Rome. Okay, so they wanted federalism along the model, I wouldn't say Switzerland, but certainly along the model of Germany. Okay, where the individual provinces have a relative autonomy in many, many different ways. Okay. Now, the Lega was part of government in various Berlusconi governments. Until today, Italy has no federalism. Until today, basically, there is no autonomy of the North, despite the fact that they were so long in government. Now, the funny thing is, and there, I claim ignorance. I have absolutely no idea why anybody in their right mind would still vote for the Lega after they fundamentally got absolutely nothing. The FPÖ, when it was in government, and that was not under when Haider was still alive, but this is under Strache, who was there was the second government when they were together with the ÖVP. Actually, the Standard, which is a major newspaper in the thing, listed about 100 things which the FPÖ did, which was all for the rich. Literal, it was like Trump. It was all, benefiting the rich, despite the fact that the FPÖ sold itself, promoted itself as the party of ordinary kind of people and of ordinary working kind of people. They didn't, give a shit about ordinary kind of people. Not at all. Now, the FPÖ basically, got into a lot of trouble because of a corruption scandal associated with Strache, and they ultimately left with the coalition collapsed, and that was the end of that. But if you look now, they're back at around 18% of the vote. And again, it's inconceivable to me why people vote for them. And the only reason I can come up with is actually this kinds of deep-seated sentiments which people have, which for whatever kind of reasons, either they are so deeply ingrained now in a number of people, or they are generated again, that they fundamentally they vote for these parties, not necessarily because they are too crazy about the parties, but simply to stick it to the others. It's kind of there was actually a wonderful kind of term for that in Austria a long time ago about the outcome of an election where the FPÖ went from like 10% to 18 or 20%. And the title was Wahltag ist Zahltag. The day of the election is the day when they're gonna pay you back, when they're gonna kind of stick you in the eye. Okay, it's ultimately, in emotional kind of sense, it's the revenge of the powerless. Okay, that's ultimately the thing they can do in order to stick it to them. They're gonna vote for these people, despite the fact that everybody tells them, they are fascists or Nazis or whatever, these kind of things. They don't give a shit. They just want to kind of show it to the political establishment. And as long as basically, and all the surveys I know, all the studies I know show that there is just a massive disenchantment all over the way with politics, with political parties, with the media, whatever. Anybody associated with the elite and whatnot. And as long as this prevails, you will always get political entrepreneurs who will ultimately try and appeal to these kinds of emotions.
Thank you. I read some question here. Andres Funes, in your opinion, Professor, the so-called political incorrectness, mobilized by the extreme right mainly because of the fears towards gender policing?
I don't see this. Oh, political submersion is mobilized by this. Political correctness. I mean, the thing is, I mean, ultimately, I mean, political correctness is as so many kind of terms and American terms and a term. And I mean, let me say something. I mean, we have a son, and our son basically he went to UCLA, and at UCLA he basically was, and he's very. I mean, he is obviously. I mean, he grew up here in Switzerland with us, and he was very kind of left-wing kind of thing, and then he went to UCLA and he was confronted with political correctness, and even he couldn't take it any longer. Now it is a political correctness is as far as I'm concerned. I mean it's very much an academic, and in academia it's a big kind of thing. But at the same time, I mean yes, I mean there is a political correct. I mean I wouldn't say political correctness. I mean, there are certain taboos which have been established. Okay, I mean, in I'm from Germany. In Germany, for example, I mean, you could not anything associated with the Holocaust, anything associated with the Nazi period. You have to be very cautious. Okay, I mean, there was until recently, it was an ordinary kind of student could not get a hand on Mein Kampf. I mean, obviously, you could read it on the internet because there were 5 versions of it, but if you went to a library, there was a special kind of section, and to read Mein Kampf. Okay. In other countries, you have other taboos basically, which are there, and so I mean the populist right ultimately. I mean for them, I mean this kind of notion that certain things are taboo. Given the fact that they consider themselves as the breakers of taboo. In German, we have taboo breaker, somebody who breaks a taboo. And as a matter of fact, I mean, Jörg Haider, for example, he was famous for basically saying things very, very consciously in order to break these kind of taboos. Obviously, I mean, for the radical populist right, political correctness is an ideal kind of field because they can promote themselves basically as the ones who dare say what others only dare to think, which basically is not for me. This is what Jörg Haider basically in Austria, you had on posters, he said, sagt, was ihr denkt. He says what you think. Okay. And the same thing, I mean, Jean-Marie Le Pen, he coined the phrase, rendre la parole au peuple, return the words to the people, let the people basically say things, okay? So, yes, I mean, political correctness is one of the triggering kind of mechanisms as far as I'm concerned, for populist mobilization. But it's just one in them. Nowadays, if you look at the radical populist right, because you talk about gender, I mean, certainly, I mean, one thing is gender, and anything associated with this, with gender, LGBTQ rights, the so-called normal family, all of these kind of things, the role of the family and whatnot, but also climate change, which is the hoax of the century. There is no climate change, and if there's a climate change, we have nothing to do with it. And even if you had one view, it's not all that grave. Now also, I mean, nowadays, even, I mean, again, COVID-19 and vaccination and all this kind of stuff goes into it. So in all of these kind of cases, there is this kind of notion that we are being told what to think, as if we couldn't think for ourselves. Okay, and if you look what's happening in the United States, I mean, I just saw in Alabama, tons of people are dying because the ICU use are full. But the governor basically says, "I am not going to tell people what to do." I mean, they can think for themselves. Well, whatever. Okay.
Thank you. Two more questions.
Parochialism, cosmopolitanism.
And here, yes, two more questions and then we finish. Si se podés leer la de Matías Seidel ahí. La última. What do you think about the relationship between the right
porque
wing?
estaba en...
No, está bien.
What do you think about the relationship between right-wing populism and authoritarian neoliberalism? Since many neoliberal and paleo-libertarian intellectuals and politicians were amongst the first to critique international institutions and the welfare system, to defend traditional values and even white supremacy against social justice warrior, opposing the angry white people to the elite.
I don't see this here on my side.
I will just
now, I mean, first of all, on this, I mean, there, this is a wide kind of, Matthias, what do you think about the relationship between right-wing populism, authoritarian neoliberalism? Many paleo-libertarian intellectuals were amongst the first to critique international institutions of welfare. On the neoliberal kind of side, I mean, it's the first kind of thing. I mean, on the neoliberal kind of side, I mean, certainly at the beginning, I mean, in a long time ago, the first of these parties which successfully mobilized actually were very neoliberal. And as a matter of fact, I mean, there is if you look at there's a book, a discussion between Jean-Marie Le Pen and an interview in which she said, actually, I was the first one before Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to basically talk about the markets and all of these kind of things. Okay. Now and certainly, I mean, the Scandinavian country parties, the two progress parties, one in Denmark, the other one in Norway, were very much neoliberals. Was a very short-lived party in Sweden called New Democracy. But also the Lega Nord was also very neoliberal. Now, neoliberal was not necessarily because they were crazy about had read Hayek or any of these or whoever, but neoliberal basically because they wanted to dismantle the state to a certain degree. Neoliberalism basically meant deprive the state and state bureaucrats of the funds which they accused these bureaucrats and government elites of dispersing in a very kind of corrupt patronage kind of way to certain clienteles. That was particularly in Italy, where the argument was, I mean, you get your votes in the South by basically, I mean, promising, whatever jobs and those kinds of. There was a certain truth to all of these kind of things. Now, this changed actually by the late 1980s, starting again with the Front National. I mean, there was a shift away from neoliberalism. This had also something to do with what Pereyra and others called the proletarization of their supporters, which were basically either blue-collar workers or what the French call the couche populaire, which is a kind of workers who do routine kind of jobs, which don't require very much training, and which are not particularly well paid. So there was these parties became kind of new working class parties, or different type of working class parties, very much substituting the traditional left. And you can see it even in a country like Switzerland, where the SVP appeals very much to these kind of people, and the socialists have a very hard time appealing to them. So this neoliberalism was kind of gone, and at the same time, I mean, the notion is, of course, I mean, there's an old notion of authoritarianism associated with working class people. Actually, when it comes to traditional kind of moral values and whatnot, I mean, it's certainly not the urban elite which is into these kind of things. So what you get is not necessarily authoritarian neoliberalism, but an authoritarian, if you want, authoritarian kind of neo-socialism. And it's not for nothing that Marine Le Pen nowadays quotes Jaurès, who was a socialist, and that she talks about the Trente Glorieuses and the golden days of the welfare state and all of these kind of things. I really don't have very much to say on this kind of question. Otherwise,
thank you. The last question. I want to come back to the political incorrectness. Don't you think that is the political incorrectness an example of the resentment, but the Nietzsche resentment? No, you know, like investment of value that what is shameful, low is covered with legitimacy. Don't you think political incorrectness will be an example of the resentment like Nietzsche think resentment?
No, political correctness, no, political incorrectness. Political incorrectness. Okay. Well, I mean, the Nietzschean kind of thing, I mean, this is fairly abstract because it's done something with Christianity and the role of Christianity and basically all of these kind of things, you know, I mean, that, you know, going back to the Sermon on the Mountain, that the meek are going to inherit the earth, you know, which Nietzsche thought was just absolutely, you know, ridiculous, you know, I mean, it was just basically a hoodwinking, you know, I mean, the weak, so they would ultimately kind of accept their fate. So I'm not particularly sure. And nowadays, if one looks at I mean, people who use ressentiment, I mean, they use ressentiment in the sense that ressentiment and like resentment is something where there is a resolution. Ultimately, you get regress. Okay, ressentiment is something where there is no solution, which kind of smolders. It goes on and on and on and on without really find an outlet, and it becomes, you know, I mean, this is when it turns into what others have called embitterment, and it has all kinds of negative psychological kind of impact on things. I don't think that is particularly useful in this kind of discussion when it comes to radical right and populism. They're not that particularly sophisticated when it comes to these kind of things, as far as I'm concerned. Now, on the political correctness, yeah, no, I mean, it's a lot of these kind of things are highly complex and very difficult to kind of disentangle. I mean, because you ultimately have to start from a certain notion, basically, which is, you know, let's say you have to start from a kind of a Gramscian notion, I guess, of hegemony, right? And there is obviously, I mean, there has been a hegemony, and the hegemony has been, you know, I mean, determined by those who are in power, or those who ultimately call the shots, and that in a country like the United States, or on a half continent like Western Europe, have been the indigenous kind of white kind of population, which had certain notions of what is moral, of what's normal, blah blah blah, all these kind of things. Now, political correctness ultimately is a challenge of that. It's a fundamental challenge to patriarchy, whatever, all of these kind of things. And suddenly notions which we took, basically, which were taken for granted, were challenged and ultimately became suspect, and then no longer salonfähig, as we say in Germany. It was no longer, you just didn't do these kind of things any longer. And I've actually, a couple of months ago, I wrote something in a different kind of context. I'll give you an example of how these things go. When I grew up in Bavaria, we had this chocolate kind of covered, inside was a foam, sugary kind of foam. Okay, was surrounded by. Now this was called in Schengen, we called it Negerkuss, the kiss of a Negro. Translated. Okay. There was another kind of thing which was called Mohrenkopf, the head of a Moor. And Moor is another word for Black African. Okay, because and then we had a children's book, and in the children's book there was one episode where you had these three kids. They are running after a black kid, and they make fun of the black kid, and then Saint Nicholas comes, and he tells them, "Don't do that." They do it anyway, so he grabs them and he puts them in a big bucket full of ink. And then they come out and they are black. And the last line is, and now they are as black as like the Moor. Okay, that was the kind of thing. All right. That's how I grew up with. Now in Switzerland, just a couple of months ago, the two main supermarket chains, Migros and Co-op, refused to buy this sugary kind of covered whatever, because the producer refused to rename it. He still calls it Negerkuss. So that's it. No more we buy. And there were other kind of things where in Switzerland. Now, funnily enough, when I go to a little town next to our town, there is a hotel, and the hotel has a sign, and the sign is the head of an African. And the thing is, the hotel is called La Tête Noire, the black head. Okay. And nobody basically so far has said anything about this kind of thing, but I'm sure somebody's going to say something about it. Okay. And that's, this is the kind of, because a lot, and I don't know whether you read that. In the Netherlands a couple of years ago, there was this big controversy over the Schwarze Peter, the Black Peter, who is the servant of Santa Claus. In German, we call it Krampus. Okay, and there was this racist and all of this kind of stuff, and it really created a big outrage in the Netherlands, because people said this is a fundamental attack at our identity, literally, kind of thing. So when you look at all of these kind of things, it's a very complicated kind of story, when it comes down to it, and it takes these are processes which take and take. But it certainly has reached now Europe, and it certainly, we also, have to, confront the notion that Europeans were involved in the slave trade. Switzerland, absolutely. People bankers and whatnot involved in the slave trade. In colonialism, despite the fact Switzerland didn't have any colonies, but basically they were involved in the colonialism and all of this kind of stuff. Nobody cared about these things, but now fundamentally, and there are tons of people who don't like that. Now, I happen to come from a country which has one of the worst histories, recent histories, in the world, and there are, again, if you look at the AfD, the radical populist right, I mean, one of their kind of things is that we have to put an end to this debate, basically. I mean, German history cannot be reduced basically to 15 years of the Third Reich. I mean. And this is a very short kind of thing to basically say, forget about the Holocaust, as Jean-Marie Le Pen says, the Holocaust was just a footnote in World War II history and all of this kind of stuff. I mean, obviously, I mean, there are these kinds of, it evokes all kinds of passions, evokes all kinds of things among people. And again, I mean, it gives an opening to the radical, to any kind of radical populist right. But that is not just, I mean, if you look at India, for example, with Modi, if you look at Turkey with Erdogan, I mean, and then you get, I mean, in this political correctness, I wouldn't say, but it's the victimization. I mean, for me, the funniest kind of thing in all of this is that actually now, basically, I mean, you get like white people are the victims of this, right? We're becoming the victims. Everybody's a victim now in India, basically. I mean, the whole Hindu nationalism is built on victimization. We were victimized by the Muslims and the British, basically. We were the greatest in the world. We already invented the internet 2 centuries ago or 3 centuries ago and whatnot. And then the Muslims came, okay, which all kind of then are used as justifications basically for reasserting the supremacy of certain groups in society or the majority in society, which is now what you get in India with Hindutva, what you get in Turkey, again, in the conflict between Turks and Kurds. There's just not very much new under the sun, I have to say. I mean, it's surprising. You look 19th century, you read 19th century American history, it's all been there. There's nothing, the same kind of tropes and the same kind of, it's amazing, Only the actors change, but fundamentally the passions don't really change.
I hope the end is not the same now than one that in the middle of the 20th century, I hope that the end now, the final, is not the same, or we will not be the same that in the middle of the century, the 20th century.
No, I don't think. I mean, no. I mean, I'm not talking about getting into the obvious international constellation. Although, I mean, if you look what's happening between China and the US, I mean that's. But anyway, no. I mean, what I'm talking about, for example, I mean, the anti-Muslim nowadays what we have in Western Europe. I mean, this anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic kind of mobilization, which echoes a lot among the public. If you look at surveys, God, in the 19th century in the United States, early part of the 19th century, had Catholics coming from Europe, and you had exactly the same response to them. Or in the 1870s, 1880s in California, I mean, the way the response to the Chinese and the Japanese too, let's not forget that. I mean, at one point, there were people saying, if you are more Japanese, California is going to be a Japanese colony. And the arguments were exactly the same as today. The outcomes very often were very much the same as today. So in that regard, I mean, there is fundamentally not very much difference, and the same resentment, economic, cultural, whatever kind of resentment was mobilized then as is being mobilized now.
Okay, well, it was a pleasure to hear you, and we want to say thank you again.
You're so welcome.
Thank you for
your chapter in our book is a masterpiece.
Yes.
No, come on.
Yes. It will be a classic article, I say.
Yes.
Yes. And thank you again for participating in the book and for talking with us today.
That was my great pleasure. It was. It's nice to finally actually see you in person. I mean, this is.
In person.
I'm always amazed, how it's possible nowadays to basically, communicate in a picture, at least, or an image with people on the other side of the world. And I see it with my wife. I mean, her parents. My wife is Chinese. Her parents are in Beijing, and they talk to each other. Or our son, he's in California, and he and us talk to each other. It's really amazing. I mean, in that respect.
That's right.
And the other thing that's amazing is that the whole thing hasn't crashed yet.
Well, but we hope that we can, in the future, we can see in person, physically, or in Argentina, or.
Oh God, I don't go anywhere. I'm too old for these kind of things,
Okay, we will go
Argentina
to Zurich soon.
Oh, it's so far, Argentina. But I have. I don't just. I read a lot on all kinds of stuff, and I read a lot on Perón. But also Gaitan. I mean, my hero in Latin America among these people is Gaitan, absolutely. But for me, I mean, what my students always ask me. Because you had people like Menem and then the Kirchners who are Peronistas. Perón was not necessarily good for Argentina. Economically, it turned out to be a disaster. I don't know.
There are a lot of lines of Peronism here.
No.
A free interpretation of what is Peronism.
Peronism is from the 80s to now, when the democracy came back, is an identity, that is empty. That, like La Closet, it's an identity empty that Menem with his neoliberalism, and then Kirchner with something like social democracy or center left or what. Intentaron try to give the sense of this empty identity. I think that you can think like this, like an empty identity that is empty, and you have the specter of Perón that gives power to this identity, and then the different actors, Menem, Kirchner, anywhere, try to, with very difficult, try to give some new meaning to this identity. But it's a beautiful problem, a beautiful subject the Peronists to study, Anyway.
I find a lot of these things absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter, what. In some cases less so, but certainly, it's fascinating. But it's always the problem, of course, for me. The problem was that I really did not understand certain things. Were very difficult to understand. It reminds me when I read, 100 Years of Solitude. 100 años de soledad and solitud.
Sí.
Soledad. And I couldn't understand, these conflicts, between
it's a wonderful book.
That I never never really understood. So, how do you pronounce? You say Gisela?
Gisela.
Okay.
Gisela.
I can see that behind you have my wife's most beloved painting.
It's mine too. Yes, Klimt.
Every time we go to Vienna, we go to the Palais to see Klimt's The Kiss.
I love him too.
It's amazing. All right.
Well, thank you very much.
We leave you.
It's a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Nothing more. Sorry for our English. It's not.
We're awful English.
Sorry.
Don't. No. I mean that never apologize for this, because if somebody laughs, what I do. I mean, I live in a French-speaking part of Switzerland. If somebody laughed when I say something wrong, I would immediately switch to German. And that's the end of them.
Yeah.
And in your case, if somebody laughs, you immediately change to Spanish, and then we'll see, how good their Spanish is.
Okay. Thank you very much for your compassion.
One should always be, people, if you talk to people who understand English, or particularly if they're Americans or English or whatnot, they should be grateful that you make an effort to speak it, quite frankly. That's my opinion on this kind of thing. I learned the damn thing, so you better, appreciate that I took the trouble to learn your language. So, no, you did a good job.
Okay. Thank you again. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for us.
I will, if I have any questions on Argentina, I will certainly write you and ask you questions.
Okay. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure, and please, we are in contact. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you to everybody who's now here, and we meet next Monday at ¿qué hora, Gisela? At 4 o'clock?
6 p.m. Argentina.
Okay.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you.